Hey everyone, it's the last video of the year and we're having a look at AMD's, ATI at the times, HD 3650, specifically Sapphire's 512MB DDR2 equipped version. The reference 3650 had its initial launch back in early 2008, but this version, at least according to what I found online, didn't see the light of day until 2 whole years later. I don't know if what I read was just an error or whether Sapphire really released another HD 3650 while we were already well into the launch window of the HD 5000 series. I can imagine Sapphire just wanted to provide a basic video adapter for media centers, so using older, and therefore cheaper, stock would have made more sense. It makes me think that this is likely what happened, considering that there are versions with much faster GDDR3 memory. Other than the memory, this has the same specs as any other HD 3650. It used the Terascale architecture and featured 378 million transistors built on the 55nm fabrication process. The HD 5000 series is on 40nm at this point. The RV635 Pro GPU, which runs at 725MHz, came with only 3 compute units, 120 shaders, 40 per compute unit, 4 raster operations pipelines, and 128 kilobytes of L2 cache. The DDR2 memory was on a 128-bit wide bus and ran at an awfully slow 405 MHz, 810 megatransfers effectively. Other than that, we have support for up to DirectX 10.1, which does limit what I can benchmark the card in, but there are still plenty of games we can test that are far newer than the HD 3650 itself. Specs for the system I'm using for the benchmarks today are on screen now, so pause for a bit if you want to have a read of that. Otherwise, I'll put them in the descriptions for anyone that needs to use a screen reader. We're kicking off with CSGO, with its 2012 release meaning that it is only 4 years younger than the 3650 itself. The developers have updated the game over the years, which does make it harder to run. Core 2 Duos, for example, could run the game with no issues in the past, but can have issues now. I went back to testing at 2 different resolutions like I used to in the past, with 848 by 480 on the left and 1152 by 648 on the right. Both are at the lowest settings. I benchmarked a few bot matches across 3 different maps, a couple of easier to run maps, Mirage and Overpass, and one of the harder to run maps, Anubis, which performs noticeably worse than the other 2 on lower end hardware. But overall, the game performed well at both resolutions. We see better performance at the lower res, but it's still not terrible on 1152 by 648 either. The worst performance comes on the Anubis map, where at 848 by 480 we see dips below 40 FPS with occasional stuttering. Otherwise, FPS is in the 45 to 60 range and the map runs alright. 1152 by 648 can dip to around 30 FPS when your teammates are around you, and occasionally we see worse dips into the 20s in intense close combat scenarios. But overall, we see around the low 30s FPS wise. The 2 other maps run quite well at both resolutions, with 1152 by 648 seeing some severe stuttering in close combat, and by close I mean point blank range. Both have the usual stuttering at the start of combat in the first round that doesn't seem to happen any other time. But other than that, there aren't any actual issues. You'll get some stuttering and smoke at the higher res though. The lower resolutions average 1% and 0.1% lows were 70.1, 25.4 and 20.1 FPS respectively, with the higher res managing 48.6, 16.3 and 12.9 FPS. The first Crysis game launched for PC nearly 16 years ago at the time of writing, and has since seen a remaster which, in my opinion, doesn't look as good as the original, even at the lowest settings. That said, it's the original we're running today, as the 3650 doesn't support the remaster anyway. I've used the same resolutions and settings as I did with CSGO, so 848 by 480 and 1152 by 648, both are at the lowest settings. The game is also running in DirectX 9 mode, as Windows 10 has issues with the default DX10 version because of the age of the game. There's a far bigger gap in performance between the 2 resolutions here than with CSGO. There aren't many issues at the lower 848 by 480 resolution. FPS is almost always over 60, and for a large part of the first level on the island, sits between 80 to 90 FPS. We can see slight stutters and hitches at points throughout, which are barely, if at all, noticeable, other than when you're standing right in front of a fire, for example. Even things like intense fighting and enormous explosions can't dip the frame rate any lower than the low to mid-50s. 1152 by 648, on the other hand, has more noticeable but still brief hitches throughout gameplay, with FPS in the mid-40s to low 50s range. Dense vegetation can see the frame rate dip into the high 30s with noticeable stuttering, and standing in front of intense fire drops us even further into the low 30s with some pretty noticeable stuttering. The benchmark figures give a non-paper view of just how big a gap in performance there is, with average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 78.3, 33.2 and 17.8 FPS respectively at 848 by 480, versus 49.4, 19.9 and 15.9 FPS for 1152 by 648's average 1% and 0.1% lows. GTA 5, a game that will be a decade old on consoles next year at the time of writing, had its PC release back in 2015. I've had to run this at the lowest possible settings, with shadows disabled through the game's configuration file, and at resolutions of 400 by 300 and 600 by 450. Those resolutions can be achieved by setting the resolution to 800 by 600, and then setting frame scaling, which is the game's resolution scale, to 0.5 and 0.75 respectively. Performance aside, I should mention first that even though the game was playable, there are various graphics and imagery missing from the game. Entire backgrounds, as you can see here, are just missing. And yes, what you're seeing is really what the startup screen looked like. Even basic things like the marker on your minimap that tells you where you are just weren't even there. This is most likely down to the latest driver for the 3650 being older in the game, therefore it has no official support for it. That aside, the 3650 at the lower resolution gets you around the low 30s to mid 40s FPS wise, and you'll see some light stutters throughout the game at points as well. The lower end of the FPS range you'll see in places like packed city centre at night time. During the daytime and further away from the centre is where you'll see closer to the higher end of the range. The same goes for 600 by 452, but that ranges from as low as the mid to high 20s in the desert area with some noticeable stutters, to the low to mid 30s in lighter graphical load areas like the highway. 400 by 300 manages 42.3, 21.1 and 13.8 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, versus the higher resolutions 30.7, 17.1 and 12.3 FPS, average 1% and 0.1% lows. The higher res does still manage to be good enough though, while being noticeably not as smooth, so a capped 30 FPS target with frame scaling set to 0.625 would be a good middle ground here. Now, I had already completed most of the testing for Saints Row 4 when they dropped an absolutely massive update for the game. This upgrade coincided with the game being given away for free on Epic Games, and brought every Windows version of the game up to the re-elected version, which includes all of the DLC, and also enables crossplay between players on Epic, Steam and GOG. I hadn't really played the game before at all, so I didn't expect how bad the textures looked, but that's not important to performance though. 640 by 480 on the left, and 848 by 480 on the right, with the lowest settings, and 16x anisotropic filtering are the settings and resolution combos I ended up using. I played through the opening section of the story mode a few times at both resolutions, and the game runs really well. Frame times for both are very consistent, which translates to next to no apparent stutter at all. The higher res FPS dips to the high 20s, but those consistent frame times mean the low frame rate isn't as noticeable as it would be otherwise. Both resolutions are in at least the low to high 30s FPS range, with 640 by 480 getting into the mid 40s as well. They have the same issues with massive explosions, like when the roof collapses from a bomb blast in the opening part of the game, where FPS would drop momentarily to around the high teens, but other than that, both ended up being quite pleasant to play. 40.2, 25.7 and 15.8 FPS is what 640 by 480 managed for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with 848x480 managing 33, 21.2 and 13.5 FPS average 1% and 0.1% lows. The higher res though would still be best in my opinion, as 640x480 is a 4:3 aspect ratio resolution, so everything gets stretched if you're using a widescreen monitor. Other than reviewing what things can do from the factory, I enjoy overclocking things I test to see what boost performance we can get. With this particular 3650, the biggest performance gains are to come from overclocking that painfully slow DDR2 memory, as using that instead of faster GDDR3 means this 3650 is severely lacking in memory performance, which can have quite a drastic impact on frame rate. That said, the card could max out the slider in MSI Afterburner at 530 MHz, which comes out as 522 MHz in-game. That doesn't seem much at first, but that's still a 31% increase in memory speed, which should amount to some pretty noticeable gains. The core clock have increased anyway, as we'll still get a little boost from that too. This went from 725 to 877 MHz. Any higher would cause stability issues. Back into CSGO, and the 1152x648 still has slight but noticeable stuttering throughout maps, such as Mirage for example, but this still managed around the low 70s to low 90 FPS range. The Overpass map was an outstanding performer though, with no stuttering and FPS in the mid 50s to the high 70s and occasionally into the 80s as well. Anubis, while it does now manage around 40 to over 60 FPS, can still occasionally have terrible stuttering in close combat. 848x480 on the other hand runs pretty well. It can still have some minor brief hitches in maps like Mirage, but Overpass runs perfectly, and Anubis, other than some slight stuttering at points, runs great for the most part. The on-paper figures give a generalisation of what the performance increase was like. 848x480 managed 83.3, 29.5 and 22.7 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, versus 70.1, 25.4 and 20.1 at stock. 1152x648 saw a near identical increase from 48.6, 16.3 and 12.9 FPS average 1% and 0.1% lows to 61.5, 19.4 and 14.2 FPS respectively. So while we see an increase, and a sizable one at that, in average frame rates, 1% and 0.1% lows haven't increased that much, showing that the stuttering is better but still there. Crysis needed the overclock dropped to 851 MHz for stability, but otherwise the difference was far more noticeable compared to CSGO, especially at the lower res. FPS was in the 70s to over 120 FPS range, depending on where you are on the map, and never dips below 60 at any point. The only issue, and it's nitpicking more than anything, is there is a slight bit of stuttering around fire, but the fire basically has to be right in your face. 1152x648 mostly runs smoothly now as well. It will still have issues, but only really in the most graphically intense scenes like the fire at the fuel station, where it will still stutter noticeably and dip to the high 30s to low 40s. The stuttering when chatting to Prophet before that bit though is still pretty bad for the higher res, but that's not a bit where you're doing anything other than listening to him talk. The higher res averages 61.4 FPS, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 25.6 and 18.7 FPS respectively, versus 49.4, 19.9 and 15.9 FPS at stock clocks. 848x480 manages nearly 100 FPS on average at 98.3 FPS, with 40 and 25.4, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, versus 78.3, 33.2 and 17.8 FPS at stock. Now, with GTA 5, I ended up using a lower overclock I had to use in Crysis, not because I had to, but because I forgot to turn it back up, and by the time I realised it was too late. But that aside, there wasn't much difference in performance from before. Both resolutions saw decent boosts to frame rates overall, but the stuttering was no different, so you end up not noticing the higher frame rate anyway. 400x300 now sits around the low to high 50s throughout the city, depending on if you're in the centre or further away, and whether it's day or nighttime. Nighttime is when FPS is lower, and the more densely packed city centre dips FPS as well. Things are actually quite smooth on the highway, where we even see over 60 FPS at times as well, but it will still stutter hard there momentarily on occasion. The higher res never really sees over the mid-40s FPS wise, and that's only on the highway. Elsewhere, like throughout the city, we're seeing between the high 20s to mid-30s at night, up to the high 30s during the day. That tends to be closer to 40 though, the further away from the centre you are, but there's also light stuttering throughout with occasionally brief hitches as well. They're not that noticeable at all, but they are there though. 600 by 450 ended up seeing a smaller improvement than the lower res did, at 37.9, 19.5 and 14.2 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, versus 30.7, 17.1 and 12.3 FPS pre-overclock. And that's most likely down to the 3650's sheer lack of horsepower, which newer games, and by newer I mean newer than other ones in the test, like GT 5 really show. 400 by 300 sees a larger increase at 52.4, 24.1 and 15.9 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rate respectively, versus 42.3, 21.1 and 13.8 FPS. And that resolution is probably where you'd want to stick around if you try to play GT 5. The game looks not good, but it's not bad enough to make it unplayable. I'd cap it at maybe 30 FPS like I'd said before, but I'm not sure about running the resolution any higher now though. And to finish off, we're back into Saints Row 4, which already ran really well pre-overclock. Even on the higher res, 848 by 480 for this game, performance is still plenty good enough for a around 30 FPS experience, which, I mean, might not be ideal, but it's still enough. The only actual issues were that it would occasionally dip just under 30 FPS, but even then, the frame times were quite consistent, so it wasn't noticeable. Enormous explosions could dip the frame rate quite hard, but only momentarily. With the overclock, it does still dip to around 20 FPS in huge explosions, but other than that, the frame rate is now in the high 30s to high 40s. 640 by 480 does also see that same roughly 20 FPS dip in huge explosions still, but like before, it runs great otherwise, now sitting in the mid 40s to mid 50s, occasionally hitting over 60 FPS. 49.2, 31.8 and 21.2 FPS is what 640 by 480 will manage for average 1% and 0.1% low frame rate respectively, versus the 40.2, 25.7 and 15.8 FPS it did pre-overclock. So you could actually increase some settings as well now and still be okay. I would say the same is true for 848 by 480, which managed average 1% and 0.1% lows of 46, 26.6 and 7.9 FPS respectively, versus 33, 21.2 and 13.5 FPS pre-overclock. You could up some settings there too, although I'd shoot for a 30 FPS target if you were to do that. To finish then, ATI's HD3650 is still decent enough for what it is. A cheap video adapter that can overclock well and play DirectX 10 games, albeit at low resolutions and settings. If you have an old PC with one in it, there's no reason to throw it away unless you're wanting to play newer games at higher settings. Even then, never throw away your old computers. There's always someone somewhere that will be able to get more use from it. But that's going to be it for now, so hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'd appreciate a like if you did, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more content like this. And thanks to Patreon supporters Shadow in the Void and Matasterak, as well as my other patrons on screen as well. You can also support me through Ko-fi, which I'll link down below. But thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Just imagine I'm waving at the camera just now, because that's what I'm still doing even though it's a voiceover.